Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to be doing notes 4.1, the causes of World War II. Your essential question, what acts of aggression led to World War II? So today should be kind of an overview of the causes of World War II. Most of this is going to be review from your world history class, but I know it's been quite a long time since you all took that class, so I wanted to make sure that we had a quick refresher before we jumped into the war. So in Europe, there was some trouble brewing. We had some leaders that had come out of the time of World War I, and they began to display signs of fascism. Throughout the 1930s, a lot of nations were wary of getting into another world war, so they started to develop this policy of appeasement. That meant that sort of like giving in to a bully, giving in to leaders like Hitler, who were kind of breaking the rules, but they were considered to be less of a threat than communist countries. Also in Asia, there was countries such as Japan that were also causing trouble as well. So Japan, this island nation here, was invading Manchuria. So they were going into these territories and spreading into China and started to take over in the early 1930s. They moved further east into China in 1937. And we weren't really doing anything to stop them. Remember, we had participated at the very end of World War I, so we didn't really want to get involved in anything again. So we have Germany spreading throughout Europe during the 1930s. We have Japan spreading out through Asia, and we have Italy moving into Africa. And if you can see, Italy here is this one that's shaped like a boot, so it would go across the Mediterranean Sea and start spreading into Africa. They had this leader here, Mussolini, and in 1935 he took his army in Italy and he invaded the country of Ethiopia. The League of Nations, remember, had been established. That was President Woodrow Wilson's idea, to have this group that could be an international peacekeeping organization. We could come together if we ever had problems before we got into war. So the League of Nations did sanction Italy during this time, so they put restrictions upon them. They said they weren't going to trade with them, but they didn't really have any way to enforce what they were doing. So within a year, by 1936, Italy had conquered the nation of Ethiopia. So Germany in the 1930s, Hitler started to violate all those rules of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, after World War I, we had the Treaty of Versailles that said Germany couldn't have a navy, they couldn't have an air force, they could only have an army of 100,000 men. Well, Germany started breaking those rules, growing up their military again. They also invaded that territory between France and Germany that they had given over to France, the Rhineland. Germany went ahead and invaded that territory and took over that land. The Western countries did denounce his behavior, but they kind of just developed this policy of appeasement to avoid any sort of problems, any sort of military conflict. And a lot of people now were pacifists, so after they had seen the horrors of what war was really like, they were opposed to any war, all wars, to prevent us from getting into it again. So the United States started passing something called the Neutrality Acts in the 1930s. This meant that we said we were going to be neutral. We weren't going to get involved in any more of Europe's conflicts. We weren't going to send any weapons. We weren't going to travel to any warring countries or give any sort of loans to any warring countries. So here are just some of the cartoons of the time. These are Dr. Seuss cartoons. So all of these problems that are happening in Europe, we said, oh, what a lucky thing that we've got separate beds. It's not our issue. That's their problem over there in Europe. And we have this little Nazi bird here chopping down all the trees in England, Norway, all of these European countries. But we said, ho hum, he's finished pecking down the last tree. He'll likely be tired. So it won't ever come to us. Not really our problem. So we have an alliance that's formed between these three countries. Germany, Italy, and Japan are going to be allies. They said that they're going to fight communism together, but they're going to stay out of each other's way when it comes to imperialism. So Germany can take over Europe, Italy can take over Africa, and Japan can take over Asia. Why Hitler wasn't stopped. So some felt that he was justified in breaking the Treaty of Versailles because the Treaty of Versailles was very harsh specifically to Germany. France had its own problems. We were going through a Great Depression in the United States and around the world. Fascism was seen as a defense against communism. Remember, we had that Red Scare after World War I was over, so we didn't want to get involved in any communist countries. And also, we started to embrace pacifism after World War I. We didn't want to get involved in any sort of war ever again. In Spain in 1936, they also had a fascist leader, this guy Francisco Franco. They had a civil war break out in their country, and Francisco Franco became a fascist dictator. Nations jumped in to support both sides of this conflict. And Germany saw this conflict within their country as an opportunity to test out his new weapons. So the Germans would come to support Franco and his side on the Civil War just so they could fly over and test out their new airplanes that they had just rebuilt. Remember, they weren't allowed to have an air force according to the Treaty of Versailles, but they were able to have new bomber planes, so they flew over and they bombed cities. They killed over 1,000 innocent civilians doing that. Hitler said, "Nature is cruel, therefore we too may be cruel. I have a right to remove millions of an inferior race that breed like vermin or rats." So Hitler began to move on as well. So we have Germany here in the middle of this yellow country. They started pushing forward through France to get some of that territory back that they had wanted, the Rhineland. And then Austria was annexed, so they decided they were going to go in and take over Austria as well. And next, they wanted this area in purple, this area of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. So in 1938, there was a conference, the Munich Conference. In the Munich Pact, they made an agreement between England and Germany that they would give Hitler that small part of Czechoslovakia, they would give Germany the Sudetenland, but Hitler had to promise not to expand into any more countries or take over any more territory. Neville Chamberlain called it the peace of our time. But of course, within 6 months, Germany would break that promise. Germany goes ahead and takes over all of Czechoslovakia, even though they had just promised that they weren't going to do that. The Germans justified this by saying that the Germans had a right to conquer inferior people. After they did this, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, so they became allies. Stalin and Hitler became allies. They both said that they won't fight each other. If the other one goes to war, they won't get involved. They would split Poland and the other parts of Eastern Europe. Stalin was trying to protect the Soviet Union from Germany, and Germany was trying to make sure that their strongest military offensive side here would not attack them. So they wanted to make an agreement there. But just a short while later, September 1st, 1939, Germany would go ahead here and they would invade Poland. Now, Poland, you can see, is between Germany and the Soviet Union, so that's going to make the Soviet Union pretty uncomfortable. Germany invades Poland and they decide that they're going to take over this territory too. This invasion of Poland by Germany marked the beginning of World War II. So this happened even though he promised he wouldn't take any more land. Hitler broke his promise, broke that pact, broke that agreement. And so within 2 days, England and France would both declare war on Germany. September 3rd, 1939, we have 3 of the biggest countries, again, in Europe, breaking out into war. And that's the end of your notes for today, so don't forget to write a summary. This is how the war started.